Okay, cool. So y'all, I'm really glad that you're able to be here. This is one of our favorite people ever. I will speak for myself, one of my favorite people ever. This is Josh Burford. He is a founder of a project called the Invisible Histories Project, which is archiving and presenting and preserving the LGBTQ history of the South. He's from Alabama. I met him through him teaching LGBTQ history at the University of Alabama. And so for those of you that have been in online classes and such, we're hopeful that this will be a much more fun and definitely much more gay online little class. So I think Josh has, yeah, you have your screen sharing permissions now. Josh, I'm just gonna let you take it away and run the show.
Thank you. Yes, this will definitely be gayer than probably what you're studying in your regular classes today, but I also built this, so that's how it's gonna work. So yeah, my name is Josh Burford. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the Director of Outreach and Lead Archivist for Invisible Histories Project. We are collecting queer and trans history now in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. To date, over 70 collections in Alabama. The earliest thing that we have in the collection right now is from 1912. The youngest thing we have in the collection is from 3 weeks ago. So it's a pretty good span of time there where, you know, it's over 100 years worth of history. We just recently, by the way, just in case you're curious, uncovered a stash of documents from Montgomery from the 1880s. And it's a whole series of articles about cross-dressers. We don't know what that means yet, but we'll see. We're going to give it to a group of scholars and let them figure it out. So all kinds of cool stuff. We also wanted to announce to you all first that we are going to be having our very first exhibit of LGBT materials at Space 111 in downtown Birmingham. They have been a huge supporter of the queer community, really right from the very beginning. In fact, their very first exhibit was a queer exhibit in 1988. And so we're going to be sending information out about that, a new timeline of local Birmingham queer history with artifacts, so we're super excited. And you all will get to participate. So today we're going to talk about Pride history. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Let me do this from the beginning. Hopefully. There it goes. So I wanted to be able to talk to you all about Pride, but I realized as I was putting this together that you can't really talk about Pride unless you talk about rioting and picketing and marching, because these things are all connected. You don't have one without the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about queer history, late 20th century. We're going to talk about Pride festivals. We're going to talk about Pride festivals in the South. And I'm going to probably complain a little bit about how much I hate Pride festivals now, considering they used to be pretty cool back in the day, at least the first time I went. But we'll see. And we'll talk about some of my favorite festivals. So I'm hoping this works. Okay, so we're going to start with rioting because it's super timely for now, but also when we began the process of building a queer community, we built our community around rioting. And so rioting is violence to the lens of the oppressed. This is visibility from the people who are the most at risk. And rioting is what we knew how to do because we had access to fear and we had access to anger, but we weren't quite ready for celebration just yet. And so when we rioted, we were local thinking nationally. So we wanted to make political and social change together, but it was fully about non-compliance. This was, nope, we have been pushed too far. We are not going to do what you're going to tell us to do, and you're going to have to deal with us. And the rioting that happened way before Stonewall, and we'll talk about Stonewall for like just a hot second, but way before Stonewall is happening at the absolute margins of queer identity. And so queer and trans people of color, sex workers, homeless youth, like young people, we were the ones who were rioting because we had the most at risk. And the rioting that happens in the 50s and 60s absolutely makes it possible for us to do anything else. And so we wanted to change. And so this quote from the bottom is from Bayard Rustin. We want nothing short of total liberation from all that seeks to oppress us. And if that is you, then get ready for a fight. And so like we were going to be fighting, and we knew it from the beginning. At the same time that we were rioting, we were marching. Marching is very different. Marching is a national focus, less local. We were looking for, in our marches, political change. And so, and you see me putting family friendly in quotes, mostly because that phrase annoys me. But the marches and the riots played together side by side. One was focused locally, one was thinking nationally. And when they marched, they were marching for very particular reasons. This was not just like generically marching. We were marching for protections from our jobs. We were marching for the end of persecution from science. We were marching for more presence in religious institutions. But the only way that the people who were organizing the marches, like the annual remembrance, which happened in Philadelphia every 4th of July, starting in the 1960s, the marches on the Pentagon in the 1950s, these were done with us appearing quote unquote professional and with us appearing in the most basic gender binary that we had access to. So the dress code for marching was dresses for women, pants and ties for men, and that was it. The idea was that if we could put people in front of the Pentagon, in front of the White House, in front of the Senate, in front of the State House in Montgomery, that we could say, look, we're very similar to you. You see us standing here, right? Please don't oppress us. And it was a solid tactic. It just wasn't a tactic that was going to work for everybody. And so rioting and marching are not at odds with each other. In fact, they're all pieces of the puzzle that allow us to do anything in the 20th century at all. So Stonewall gets a lot of credit for being the beginning of the LGBT civil rights movement. If you learn nothing else from today, just take away that Stonewall wasn't the start of nothing. Stonewall happened, it was interesting, it was big, it got a ton of press because it happened in New York at the end of the 1960s, but it was not the beginning. Stonewall was the culmination of 20 years of organizing. Hell, even longer than that, you can go back 40 years if you want to and look at what we were doing. Really, the first riot we have is in 1959. This is a full decade before Stonewall. This is the Cooper's Donut Shop riot. Los Angeles, the rioters in this place, oh, and I should have probably said something about the language on some of these slides, so sorry about that. But I'm having you see this slide because Cooper's Donut Shop was sort of like a cross between a Krispy Kreme and a Waffle House. And so it was a place that you could go after hours. It was open 24 hours and you can go and eat. A lot of young homeless queer kids, a lot of hustlers, a lot of trans women, a lot of drag performers would go there late at night after they had been at the club or after they had been at work, and they could sit in the corner and spend $1 and feed everybody, and they were safe. Cooper's Donut Shop was a chain, so they were all over California. But the one in LA for a long time was considered a spot. Like if you were a queer person of color, you're a trans person, you could go there and nobody would bother you. In 1959, they got a new owner. That owner decided that it was not going to work for him to have these quote unquote outsiders in his space. And so he puts this sign up on the back, which by the way, he misspelled faggot just as a BS. So I guess we can't even have our oppressors to remember how to spell our hateful words, but whatever, it's fine. So he put this sign up, and instead of stalling out trans people and queer people going, it actually made them show up in greater numbers. And so one night in 1959, they were a group of people, there were 10 sitting in a corner, and they were having late dinner, and he called the cops. And when the cops showed up, the cops were only in the building for about 5 minutes before one of them got punched directly in the face by a tall trans woman of color, which started this riot. And the riot ripples out because at the same time in 1959, a group of very white, very cis, very trying to fit in gays were marching in front of the Pentagon. So these two things are happening at the same time. When Cooper's Donut Shop happens, it ripples out in the gay press all the way to Washington, D.C. And the folks organizing there said, oh, we've got to make sure we remember what just happened because this could happen again. Because there was this idea that we would just go quietly, that we would just get into the back of the police car and we would go to the jail and that'd be the end of it. So this was really the first time that we were like, nope, that is not going to work. We're not going to do that. So this is what you'll see here are pictures of people marching in front of the White House. This is between 1965 and 1968. The man that's right in the back holding the sign that says, "We want freedoms," that's Frank Kameny. Frank Kameny was he was the first gay man in the United States to sue the federal government for his job. He graduated from college at 15. He got a job working for the federal government at 19. He was an astronomer. He was super smart. And in the 1950s, when we were afraid of the Russians and afraid of communists, afraid of everybody, he was one of about 2,500 gay men and women who were fired from their job in the first part of the 1950s, except he went back and sued. And he sued and went all the way to the Supreme Court. He did this over and over and over again. So Kameny marched in front of the buildings that he worked in so that he could show them, look, this is what you're losing. You're losing people that are smart. You're losing people that are working hard just because you're afraid of communists. By the way, if they had let gay people come out in the 50s and 60s, this wouldn't have been a problem. Because what they were afraid of was that communists would find out that they were gay and then blackmail them. Well, that's an easy fix. Let everybody out of the closet and we good. And everybody go back to work. Now, I say assimilationist, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way, although mostly when I say it, I mean it in a bad way. It's just that they had a point to prove. They had a point to prove that they could function in quote unquote regular society along with everyone else, and there was nothing about them that made them a risk. By the way, every single one of these signs that you see here in this picture are at the Smithsonian American History Museum in the Frank Kameny collection. And I actually got to hold that sign that Frank Kameny is holding at the Smithsonian, and it was super cool, and I might have cried a little bit. So just to keep it all in perspective, I cried a little bit.
Josh, that's adorable. There's a question in the chat.
Oh, yeah, I can't see the chat from where I am.
Weren't communists cool with the gays? I may be confused.
Well, so that's a really good question. So at its most basic, the answer is yes. The Communist Party didn't believe that sexuality or even gender really had anything to do with how an individual could function within the Communist Party, because the Communist Party was about resource allocation. So they wanted to make sure that everybody had an equal share of the pie. They didn't care if people were gay or lesbian or anything else. But again, that's a broad picture of like what communism was about. How it was applied to individual groups was a little bit different. Bayard Rustin was a communist when he first came out. Even before he started working with Martin Luther King, but his communism was actually a bigger problem for the first part of his life than the fact that he was gay, which came later. So yeah, for the most part, communists were fine with gay people because it didn't have anything to do. Communists wanted gay people to have the same health care as everybody else too. So that's a really good question. Thank you, Lauren. So this might be hard to see, but I'll send the file so you guys can see it. But this is What to Do When You're Arrested pamphlet that was put out by ECHO, which is the East Coast Homophile Organization. They would put these out to everyone who was rioting or picketing or marching in the US. And it was what to do in case you got arrested. Basically, it's, I can boil this whole sheet down to one thing: don't talk to cops. And so they gave you resources to reach out to find lawyers. They gave you local resources. You can see here in this pullout, in case of incarceration, your choice is not between telling truth or untruth, but speaking or not speaking. Because what happened to people is they would say, we're not gay, and then later they would come out and find out they were gay, and then they get in trouble. But ECHO was an amazing organization whose sole responsibility at the time was to make certain that if you got arrested, that you could get out and get back into your job and your work and other things that you were doing. So these are two more. I really wanted you to get a sense, because the change happens really quickly. You might notice some commonality with these people in this picture. Do they seem very white to you? And I know it's a black and white picture, but you see what I'm saying. Also very conservatively dressed people. They did a lot of really good work, but they got real annoyed after the Stonewall riots that the new movement for queer liberation left them behind. Because the young people who were fighting and rioting saw this as their parents' generation. And so there's a lot of perceived conflict. But in this quote, we built the airplane and those queens from Stonewall just climbed into it and flew off with it. So what doesn't really translate as well to your generation, and I'm hoping that it will eventually, is that the movement is being led by young people. But this is not an old people's movement. And the thing that we have lost, I think, the further we've gone into the 21st century, is that this group of people here that represents marching, they were on their way out when young people were on their way in. And so I think that's the thing that I really want you all to think about, is what your place in the movement is from your perspective, what you could bring to the table. Because the truth is, it was young people who were doing it. So you guys might have heard of Compton's Cafeteria, August '66 in the Tenderloin. What's really interesting about Compton's Cafeteria is that it mirrors the Cooper's Donut Shop riot almost in its entirety. Trans folk, queer people of color, sex workers thrown out of Compton's Cafeteria, and they fought back like hardcore. at Compton's cafeteria, breaking out windows, fighting with the cops. At the time, and I think the piece of this that's missing is, and the thing that always makes me really smile, is that it was illegal to, quote, dress incorrectly. What this meant was that if you were assigned male or female at birth, you had to be able to prove that you were affiliated with that identity by your clothing. Now, the trick was that the law was actually written by cisgender people who didn't understand how trans people work. And so the law actually only said you had to be wearing 2 articles of clothing based on your birth assigned gender. And so a lot of people just wore like boys or girls underwear under their clothes, or they would wear a t-shirt underneath it. And so if they got arrested, they could say, no, look, I'm wearing boy socks and boys shirts or whatever, and that would be fine. They started to be, trans people in the Tenderloin were known as hair fairies. I love this and wish we would bring this back, because the hair fairy idea was this idea that a person would come in and they were just so coiffed and built up and fabulous that they just took up all this space. But what happens, more importantly than the riot itself, is what happens after Compton's cafeteria, which is the National Transsexual Counseling Unit is formed. This is the very first time that a group of trans people started advocating for themselves with being supported by the larger community. They raised a ton of money in San Francisco after Compton's to be able to help people to transition, to be able to help people get counseling services that were affirming. And so this is a real serious change. Again, you can see marching in front of the White House, national. This, very local. So the NTCU was in San Francisco. This model for the NTCU is used all over the US after the Stonewall riots. 2 other things that are very important. The first LGBT student group in the entire country is formed. They were called Vanguard. Vanguard was so fascinating because the president of Vanguard at the time was 17 years old. And so we're talking high school age people, like 17 to mid 20s. They elected their own officers, they created their own organization, they raised their own money. And so what they were able to do was they found a supportive congregation called the Guild Memorial Church that gave them a space, and Vanguard built a queer youth organization for themselves on their own terms. This model is so important when you're thinking about the work that you're doing with Magic City Acceptance Center, because it's about leading, about being in the leadership areas of what you're doing. Street Orphans was another group that came out of it that works specifically to protect homeless lesbian women, gay men, trans people, and hustlers. And so these 2 groups are working together simultaneously. One, to make sure that the youth were being affirmed, protected, and leading and being trained, while the other group was on the street, making sure people were safe and being fed and getting all the things that they needed. The Black Cat Tavern riot does not get as much credit as it should. This is why this one is important. The Black Cat Tavern riot set a new precedent. They created a new method of rioting called the kiss-in at this event. So this was New Year's Eve, 1967. They waited until there was undercover cops in the bar. They dropped the balloons and people were kissing. And as soon as people started kissing, the cops showed up and started to arrest people, and then calling them sex offenders. So on February the 11th, this was a pre-Valentine's Day event. Actually, I just realized that it should be 1968. February 11th, 1968, a riot with over 500 people show up at the bar to protest what had happened on New Year's Eve. And they held a demonstration and had a kiss-in where they coupled up with people they knew and people they didn't know, and they made out in front of the cops. And so people got arrested, but at that demonstration, a group was formed, a group called Pride, Personal Rights in Defense and Education. This is when Pride really starts to be a thing that we were thinking about, because again, we knew how to be afraid. We knew what it felt like to be alone. We knew what it felt like to really internalize all that fear that there's something wrong with us. What we didn't know how to do was feel pride in who we were. And it's at the Black Cat Tavern riot where pride as a thing begins to become real for us. Celebration. So Stonewall happens, and we just had the Stonewall 50th was it last year? God, I don't even know what year it is. Last year was Stonewall 50, so 2019. And again, Stonewall mirrors very clearly what happened at the Cooper's Donut Shop and what happened at Compton's Cafeteria. What's interesting about Stonewall is that when the queens at Stonewall and the trans women of color at Stonewall and the people who were out of work that were at Stonewall, and by the way, Stonewall was disgusting. It was a divey bar that was run by the mob. Like, it was gross, but it was a place where you could go if you were a sex worker or you were a trans woman and be left alone, because all they gave a crap about was that you could pay your bill. And so people showed up. It was cheap to drink there. And when the Stonewall riots happened, the reason why Stonewall gets the credit that it does over everything else is because what happens the 3 days after Stonewall, the riots in the past with Coopers and with Compton's were one night. It was a one-night riot. Stonewall is 3 nights. And so the people come back to Stonewall to riot for days and days and days after the actual riot happened. And people started flying in from all over the country to be in New York at the time to bolster the numbers so that people could really show up and say, look. My favorite thing about the Stonewall riot, I know this is kind of like nitpicky, but you can see in this picture, this door, and it has that little archway over the top. When they went to arrest, and again, nobody knows who threw the first punch at Stonewall. And it doesn't necessarily matter. What does matter is that riot is kicked off by trans people of color. And so don't let people tell you different. That's what was happening at Stonewall. Could it have been Marsha P? Marsha P. Johnson was interviewed several times by oral historians, and she said that she wasn't sure if she was there at the beginning, but she was damn well sure she was there at the end. It could have been Gladys Bentley. Gladys Bentley was a famous, she identified as a dyke, famous dyke singer from the 1920s who used to walk around Stonewall in a white suit all the time. It's real likely Gladys Bentley was the one who threw that first punch. But after the punch is thrown and the riots began, the cops that were there were only 3 of them. The cops grabbed someone as a hostage, pulled them into the bar. The guy that they grabbed was the only straight person who happened to be in the audience at the time. So how's that for ironic? He was there visiting friends. And so what they thought was that the people outside would just disperse. But instead, they bust out this window with a trash can. They famously pulled up about 10 parking meters out of the concrete as a group of people. I have no idea how they did that. And in that little transom window that's over the door, somebody threw a brick through it and started shooting lighter fluid into the bar and tossing matches into the bar. So we're talking like a serious deal. This wasn't like some little tiny thing. And we're talking there were maybe 50 people in the bar. By 1 o'clock that morning, there were maybe like 300 people. And then people started running around the village yelling gay power, it's happening. And so that crowd swelled to over 2,000 before the night was over. And that number just got bigger and bigger and bigger. So what Stonewall did get was good press. It got really, really good press. And so all of a sudden, everything that we've been building to, single night riots and marching and memorials and a feeling of pride, it coalesces at Stonewall and gives a national voice to what was a local movement. And so this was the place where people started to really organize around. We planted a rainbow flag. Actually, we're still 10 years away from rainbow flag, but we planted a flag at Stonewall and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build around this. So no more of this polite walking in circles. We're going to talk about working class people, homeless youth, drag queens, trans people of color, all happening at Stonewall. So, because we couldn't help ourselves, 1 year to the day from Stonewall, June 28th, 1970, Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade was held. You'll notice it's not called Pride at this point, but the Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade was a memorial for the Stonewall riots. They marched down 6th Avenue in New York. It was probably in a neighborhood of about 5,000 people, which is a lot of people, a lot of gay people in one spot in the 70s. Marching down Christopher Street, one side of the street being heckled, the other side of the street people yelling support. And they marched to the Central Park where they had what they called a gay inn, where everybody was just kind of gay and together. And it was at that sort of gay inn event that we started to think, what we're really showing here is how proud we are to be gay and that we are not going back into the closet. And so this first New York Pride Parade is so important. I will say this too, just to brag just a nice little bit on Invisible Histories, but we actually, within the last several months, have collected a poster from the second annual 1971 Pride Festival in New York, which is now here in Birmingham, which we're having digitized, so you'll be able to see it, but you should see it. It is beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And they would literally print these by hand, roll them up, and hand them out to people. And so Pride starts as a way for us to show our political leanings, for us to be together, for us to show solidarity. Every imaginable group of people with every imaginable identity is marching together in this 1970 parade. And when it went well, which it really did, and we knew we were going to do this again, suddenly other Pride festivals began to pop up around the country. This is a picture of a group of people. I just like this picture of this half-naked hippie, if I'm just being 100% honest with you. But you can see, I know that picture's super grainy, but we've got gay pride, we have lesbian pride, we have people that were coming out for the very first time on the sheep meadow in Central Park and really understanding that we were all together. Like there was a movement of people who were all together and that we were going to have to fight for each other. I actually really like this picture too, because lesbian as an identity category, this is when lesbian begins to become a forefront identity within the movement. We'd all been gay people up until the early part of the 70s, when lesbian women said, listen, we appreciate you, this has been cute, but real talk, as women, we have different issues than men, so we're gonna have to stop pretending like we're the same people. And so having a sign that says lesbians on it is no joke at this time. So just to give you a sense of the difference here, on the left is a picture of a group of people that have been picketing in front of the Pentagon. And on the right, we have a group of people who had been at the Stonewall riots. So you can see a very distinct difference between these two people. There's a gender difference, there's a race difference, there's a class difference between these people. The old guard and the new guard, all together, fighting, they didn't play well together a lot in the 70s, but they got past a lot of it so they could actually begin to support themselves. So in 1971, we have a pride in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Francisco. The LA Pride and the Chicago Prides were pretty smallish, but they did pretty well. As you can imagine, the San Francisco Pride was trying to outdo the New York Pride, and they've been arm wrestling each other for pride supremacy for years. Plot twist, the largest pride in the entire world is in Brazil, and it has for the last 40 years. So sorry, Los Angeles and New York and San Francisco, but it's actually Brazil. In 1972, Atlanta has its first Pride Festival. This is why this is important. Not only is Atlanta the oldest pride in the Deep South, this goes counter completely to this narrative that we have that the South was behind. We were not behind. We were just doing things at a different pace. You have Pride in 1970. In 1971, you have Gay Liberation Front. In 1972, we have a Pride Festival in the South and radical organizers all over, including, by the way, a radical queer newspaper in Auburn, Alabama, that was published in 1972 to 1974, which we are currently having digitized so that you can read it. It's called Praxis. It's fairly stunning, if I'm being honest. And by the end of the 70s, there were gay pride days happening. A lot of people were afraid of a full festival because they would draw attention to themselves. And so there were like little gay pride days that kind of popped up. Theoretically, Birmingham has its first pride in 1980, but there was a gay pride day that was held. It was probably only like 30 people, but it was held at a home in Forest Park in Birmingham. It was a little teeny. It was like a little baby gay pride day. So I imagine it's like a bunch of people sitting under a tree waving a little tiny rainbow flag and cooking out. But by 2011, the celebratory Pride Festival is common everywhere. You've got prides all over the place. Huge cities, tiny towns, little bitty places all over the South. So by the mid-1980s, Atlanta Pride is the largest in the entire South and not just the oldest. It outdoes everybody. Atlanta Pride 1994 was my very first Pride that I went to. I'd only been out of the closet for 3 months and went to Atlanta Pride, and it was shocking for me, shocking, but great at the same time. In 1986, Atlanta Pride added the annual Dyke March. The Dyke March was 100% about lesbian organizers politically active in the process. It's where Dykes on Bikes got started, where Dykes would literally ride around on big Harley Davidson motorcycles, which is amazing. By 2000, Atlanta adds a trans rights march, which was small at the beginning, has gotten much larger, and in 2019 added a march for pan and bi visibility. So come on, Atlanta, like doing the most in Atlanta. I just read about this bi pan visibility thing today, and I was like, that's no joke. Of course, I know all of our prides are virtual this year, but this should, keep us smiling until we can get back together again at one of those family-friendly prides we like so much around here. But on the right, you see a picture from the 1976 Atlanta Pride March for Gay Rights, or the Atlanta Gay Rights Alliance. And the picture on this side is from the original Pride Festival called Don't Grow Up Invisible, which I actually really love that so much. And not just because we're Invisible Histories, but also because I love the idea that we were fighting for visibility like right at the very beginning. So that makes me super happy. By the way, the Atlanta Pride has a great archive at Georgia State University in Atlanta. If you ever want to go and look through their stuff, they have amazing stuff in their collections. So, not to be skipped, the first March on Washington. 1979, gays and lesbians took what they had learned. In fact, Byron Rustin, who had organized the first March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in the 50s, is on the board to help organize the National March for Lesbian and Gay Rights in DC. What's really, really, really important about this moment is what we did was we took those ideas of political change, we took grassroots organizers, and we took the model for gay pride, which is if you have an event, gay people will show up. And we created a moment of sustained activism. So this just isn't a bunch of pissed off gays in California. This is organized gay people organizing around, at this point, Harvey Milk had been assassinated. Activists from the Stonewall Riots, their groups were not really holding up as well. And so they create this march because they were really, really concerned about a movement that was happening in the gay community at the end of the 70s towards a more what we would call neoconservative idea. This idea of we're just like you. Because the 70s had been about anti-assimilation. It had been about radical beliefs. And as we got closer and closer to the 80s, people were like, well, we just want to fit in. We just want to do X, Y, and Z. And so it was a moment for us to go, no, 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 that's not how this is going to work. We need to show up in numbers. We need to march. And we need to show people that we have a sustained level of activism. I'm going to put a link in the chat when I get done with my presentation because there's a queer historian in Texas named J.D. Doyle who has digitized all of the materials related to the 79, the 87, and the 93 March on Washington. So you actually can take some time to look through that. It's very, very cool. So this is the program from the 79 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom and for lesbian and gay rights. And so this is what the quote, if Stonewall marked the beginning of the modern gay movement, the first national queer march in 79 was its coming out party. Now, I know we take this for granted now, but coming out, the idea of us coming out was born in the 70s. It's born in 1975. What's different about coming out now than then was that when we came out in the 70s, it wasn't necessarily a personal story. It wasn't about us coming out. It was about us taking up space. And so people came out as teachers and doctors and nurses and lawyers and Christians and Jews and Muslims because we needed to take up space. People needed to see that you don't understand, we are literally everywhere. And so this is our coming out party. This is when we said, we're going to be real serious about this and y'all need to watch out because stuff's about to happen. So Birmingham has its first Gay Pride Day in 1980. It was sponsored by the Lambda Center. The Lambda Center was the first LGBT center that was opened in Birmingham. It opened in 1980. It was open until 1993. And as we're very fond of saying at IHP, the Lambda Center opens exactly 5 years before the LGBT Center of New York opened. So not that it's a competition, but if it were, we'd be winning. We were open 5 years before New York, so whatever. But the Lambda Center imagined itself as a drop-in space, as a place for you to get resources, as a place for groups to meet. And this Gay Pride Day in 1980 was sponsored by Lambda. Now, it was an invitation-only event, and it was at a private home, but it had a much larger reach. It really was a time for Birmingham to put its toe in the water and go, you think we can do this? All right, then show up. And if you show up, we'll do this again. And so they did. People had Gay Pride Days all throughout the 80s. In 1987, for the second March on Washington, A group of lesbians and gay men from all over Alabama get in fact, in Birmingham, it was 15 lesbian women, all different ages, who piled into this huge camper, and they drove to DC together, and they marched on Washington. While they were in Washington in '87, they had the idea of having a pride march in Birmingham. And so they return, and in '88, the planning begins for the first gay pride march, a political march in Birmingham, not just a celebratory one, but a political one. I'm happy to say, and I think Lauren can point you at our website, but we have a video of the first gay pride march in Birmingham on our website. And it's like 9 minutes long. You should absolutely watch it. But it was held on June 28th, '89 in Rushton Park. By the way, gayest thing you're going to hear in this whole presentation, but they had it at Rushton Park because in one of the private homes across the street, Rushton Park, by the way, was a place where gay men were always hooking up all the time and getting arrested in the park for sex. But there was a woman who lived across the street. She was an old lady, and she was calling the cops all the time on gay men in the park, even if they weren't doing anything. And so when they started to organize for the first gay pride march, they had it across the street from her house on purpose, which I love so much. Love it. I mean, that is so gay and so petty, and I love it. I love it. I love it. So this is the brochure from the '87 March on Washington. Now you can see some things starting to crop up here that'll seem familiar to you. We start using the pink triangle. At this point, we're having a conversation about HIV/AIDS, and so it's important for us to claim this marker for ourselves. We adopted a civil rights strategy. We can have a whole separate hour. We can talk about whether or not that was a good idea or not, because the leadership of this '87 March was very white, and they started comparing themselves to Black civil rights leaders, and I didn't really stand up to scrutiny or hold up very well, especially for queer people of color, but we can talk about that later. But we had some goals. Those goals included AIDS. It included decriminalizing our same-sex behavior, which is what Bowers v. Hardwick was about. It was about putting the AIDS quilt into motion. And it was the very first time that the Human Rights Council had a fundraiser event for supporting a national movement. 500,000 people plus are there. I actually watched the '87 March on Washington on TV with my mom, which was distressing when I was not out of the closet in the 7th grade. But I remember seeing the AIDS quilt on the lawn and thinking holy shit, this is a moment for us. That AIDS quilt, by the way, had dozens and dozens of panels that were made right here in Birmingham, in Avondale, at the church next to Avondale Park. In fact, leading up to the march, there were a group of older straight women who were seamstresses who volunteered to make AIDS panels for people. And so they just sewed and sewed and sewed panels right up until the day they left. All of those panels, by the way, are now in an archive in San Francisco. But this is what it looked like. I mean, that is the entire National Mall. And to keep it scale and perspective, each one of these rectangles is made up of 3 across, 2 down panels. Each panel is 4 to 6 different people. That is a lot of people. And every one of those is a memory. It is an expression of love. But what I'm putting this was a handbook that was put out about nonviolent civil disobedience. What this was about was allowing people to come to the march and to be civilly disobedient and to allow themselves to be arrested if possible. But this is the most intersectional piece of queer ephemera I've ever seen. It talks about, there's a whole section for how white people could not be racist in it. There's a whole section about implied sexism against lesbians. There was a whole section about ableism in it. You can even see on the cover, there's an actual human in a wheelchair on the cover of this. This is way ahead of its time. And I think represents that moment that we were doing something really unique and new. So on the left, you see a group of lesbian women that had caravanned up to Washington, D.C., including the woman that's holding the sign that says Lesbian Alabama Grandmother. That's Bootsy Taylor. Bootsy was basically everybody's lesbian grandmother in Birmingham up until the moment she died. She raised entire generations of homeless lesbian women in Birmingham in her home in 5 Points, took them in. The woman that is on the far left holding the other woman's hand, that's Beth Gunderson. She comes back from the '87 March on Washington and raises money to open the first gay and lesbian bookstore in Alabama in 5 Points called Lodestar Books. The woman in the back with the sunglasses is Lissa LeGrand, who you hear every single day on NPR. And so that's her marching the 87th March on Washington. The picture on the right is the cover of the Alabama Forum from here in Birmingham for our first Gay Pride March. Proud enough to make history was the theme, which I think is beautiful. I love that so much. So in the 90s, things start to go just a little hanky for us. You know, we were fighting so hard for folks to get access to healthcare for AIDS because people were dying in numbers that were huge and we couldn't handle them. And so the attendance, as you can see here, for the 93 March on Washington is not as stellar as they had imagined it would be. But here's some things to remember. One, for the 93 March on Washington is the first time that bisexuals are included in the planning committee and in the terminology. So it is the March on Washington for gay, lesbian, and bi equal rights and liberation. Now, I'm gonna tell you what, that B did not come easy. Bi people fought, kicked, bit people, kicked in doors so they could be included, and they should have. And so the inclusion of bi people is super important. There were entire groups of bi people marching from all over the South. A group called the Bisexual Network of North Carolina, a group of bi people from South Alabama, a group of bi people from Florida, all marching together. Also, at the time, this was when trans people circled back around and said, hey, we've been left out of the conversation for the last 10 years. We need back at the table. And so although trans people are not in the title, so it's not LGBT equal rights and liberation, they were included in the platform for the movement and in the literature. People felt like the addition of the B was going to be difficult enough to explain because it was, again, bisexuality is not new. When I say new, I mean new to, you know, this moment, not new to people. But they felt like trans people would be too complicated to explain, and so they'd make it into the title. They will later. And even though this event didn't have the same turnout level, this is the first time we ever had gay celebrities at an event. And so there are a lot of gay celebrities that were there. But people felt like that the AIDS epidemic took up so much oxygen in the room that there wasn't enough for people who were not in the fight for HIV/AIDS to really rally around. And so a lot of people feel like the 93 March doesn't do as much as it could. But we were at the 93 March. On the left is a picture of UA's Gay and Lesbian Alliance marching. They marched alongside Auburn's Gay and Lesbian Association in the 93 March on Washington together. What I love about this picture is like this, you know, this whatever perceived rivalry between these two schools, but we were so organized in the queer community in Alabama that we were always doing this work together. And this 93 group, by the way, from UA was super political. I only missed going to the 93 March on Washington by 2 months because I was still in high school when this is happening. And then I wasn't starting my school at UA until the fall of 93, so I missed it. I also wasn't out of the closet, which might have been a teeny problem for me marching in the 93 March on Washington, but that's neither here nor there. Also in 94, the 25th anniversary of Stonewall. This is super, super important for one particular reason. This picture here, these are the surviving original Stonewall veterans. They had formed the Stonewall Veterans Association. This is a very different picture than what you see in the leadership of national groups. You see Sylvia Rivera, you see Marsha P., you see people that were in the movement, you see trans women of color. What happens at the 25th anniversary wasn't good for us. It was not good. They were going to combine the Pride Festival and the 25th anniversary at the same time. The day of the festival, actually 2 days before the festival, they were doing a practice run with where people were going to be. And the Stonewall veterans were supposed to be at the front of the parade, obviously, because it's the 25th Stonewall. But the organization that was putting it together said that, quote, it would be too distracting to have trans people and queer people of color at the front of the parade. So they were going to move them to the back of the parade, which should carry every implication of that you want. And so what happened is the Stonewall veterans said, well, you can go jump off a cliff. We'll do our own thing. And so they organized a counter march, and they literally marched 2 blocks over side by side. And basically, from the oral histories of Sylvia Rivera, she said every time she got to an intersection, she just flicked off the people on the parade that was 2 blocks over. But again, that schism between trans people and white cisgender gays is in this moment. Now, again, there were people from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, Florida, and the Carolinas marching in the 25th anniversary. In fact, in Charlotte, North Carolina, their Pride Festival was the day before. And so they marched in their own Pride March and then got in a bus and drove to New York and never went to sleep and marched in the 25th anniversary Stonewall. So this is happening all at the same time. So there's an amazing collection of Stonewall photographs that are free and online for you to look at. What I would suggest you do is when we get off this, I mean, you can always ask me if you want to. Sorry, I'm having a project emergency. Just got to send a quick text. Sorry about that. What they've done in the New York Public Library is they've taken all the photos they could get from the 25th anniversary and they've put them free online. And so you can go to New York Public Library, type in Stonewall 25th, and look at hundreds of photos from at the time. I just like this recovering Catholic shirt. That's the only reason I picked this picture. It was one of 300 pictures and it made me smile. So I put that on there. Here's this, and sorry for the quality of the photos. Here's the Stonewall veterans together marching in the counter parade, which I think is amazing. And then we get to 2000. So I know that we're going through this, but think about 1979's liberation for all gay and lesbian people. And think about the 87 marches, full inclusion of all identities, AIDS is not going to kill us march. And then when we get to the 2000s march, it was called Faith and Family. Now, this is fully off the rails at the time. Nobody knew what the hell was going on at the 2000 Millennium March in Washington. It was so poorly planned. There were all of these grassroots people that had been brought in to be at the table, to say, hey, how should we do this? It's the first decade of the 2000s. We need to start it off right. And instead, what happened is the HRC and some other people raised a bunch of money and hired some rock and roll stars to come in. And they basically had a Pride Light festival instead of an actual march. And so there's nothing political about this. I mean, I don't know what's political about faith and family, but this is when that liberation mentality was as far from Stonewall as it could possibly have been. And so all of this money went missing. $330,000 goes missing. People don't know what happened. When people showed up to go to a political march, what they found was, quote, an excuse for a big party. And basically what queer people of color and trans people in 2000 were faced with a dilemma. They had been left out of all of the materials. They'd been left out of the alphabet soup. It was just LGB. Actually, it was GLB at the time. And then all of a sudden, one afternoon, a group of trans people in DC picked up a pamphlet from the Human Rights Campaign, and it said, what to do about trans people. And they were like, what the hell is this? And so all of a sudden, it was LGBT, and nobody had talked to trans people about what that was going to look like. So this is the flashpoint. We go literally from having like 3 identities at the time. You could have been identified as transgender. That had been around since the 60s. There were transsexual people. That was a thing. And there were people who were pushing back. We weren't ready quite to call it genderqueer yet, but we were real close. We were like super, super close. There is an explosion in trans identities after 2000 for this reason right here. Because trans people were like, if we don't get this together, we're going to get left out or stepped on. And so the Millennium March is the moment. This is also the moment when the trans show up places, when you can see trans people creating their own iconography. So Pride festivals, I mean, it depends on who you ask. I think that when they're done with the community in mind, Pride festivals can be really amazing. You all know exactly what I'm talking about when you go to your first Pride and you always see like people at their first Pride and how excited they are. Like, I want to mirror that excitement because that's very cool. The problem is, because capitalism is a thing, Pride festivals now have become more of a tourist attraction than they have become a rallying cry for LGBT civil rights. And so it's shifted what we think about gay pride. So we've gone from liberation and freedom towards a more kind of neutral pride feeling that doesn't really have a lot of nuance in it. And people want to say parade instead of march because a parade seems politically neutral. Again, these are the problems that I personally have had watching Pride festivals in my own lifetime change and evolve. Are there still ways to do prides politically? Yes. And if you want to see a good example, go online and look up Triangle Pride, which is the Pride festival that is had in Raleigh and Durham. 3 years ago, a group of Black Lives Matter activists who were all queer and trans people of color were marching in the parade. They had signed up, they had a banner, they were marching down the streets in Durham, and they put up a sign that said, "All lives can't matter until Black lives matter," which for those of us who are awake, and it's the 21st century, understand and echo. And then a group of organizers came over and asked them to leave and said this wasn't a political space and it was family friendly and they shouldn't, why do they have to make this about politics? What they didn't really understand is that the trans population of Durham, North Carolina is twice what it is anywhere else in North Carolina. And so instead of walking quietly off to the side, they turned around and said, "What do you think you're doing?" and just sat in the middle of the street, and then looked around, and all the LGBT student groups from colleges and all the community groups also came over and sat down. And so they just stopped the parade dead center middle of the street. And it fully changed how Pride was done in that part of North Carolina. So it can still be political. It's just harder to see it. Also, nowadays, I think people expect Pride festivals to be like, you know, like a 2-hour parade with beads and then like a festival with tables and then like some A-list celebrity. I mean, it can be those things. I'm a postmodernist. Things can be two things. It's fine. Go see Lady Gaga at a Pride festival if you want to. I'd like to see her at a Pride festival too. But it doesn't just have to be one thing. And especially when you're at the margins, this really should be a place for you to be able to stand up. Drag queens, and I'm putting fringe queers here in quotes, but only to make myself laugh. We have always had a place in Pride festivals, and as opposed to being hidden from view, we have a place at the front of the line. And so we were just a ragtag group of people, and we went from that to an entire month of June being Pride Month. So when President Clinton was the first president to ever declare a Pride Month in June for people. That Pride Month, if you can believe it, Bush also declared a month of Pride Month. I mean, that should not excuse him. He's a war criminal. He's terrible. But he also said it. And then when we get to Obama, Obama goes even further to create an LGBT part of his website. So we've gone from that group of like half-naked hippies to a fully recognized, like by the highest office in the country group of people. The question is, what are we still doing with our Pride festivals? And I think this is something that you all as a group of people should talk about amongst yourselves when you have time. Because this idea of family-friendly prides makes me nervous and uncomfortable. Because what it does is that it takes those within our own community who are already in a position of power, able-bodied, white, cisgender, wealthy people, and then allows them to push out the people who are not family-friendly. So people involved in the fetish community, people who are involved in sex work, trans people of color, queer people of color, any of that stuff that doesn't fit easily into that love is love narrative, it's much easier to do this to. And so people have said, well, we don't need prides anymore because now everything is fine. I mean, I put LGBT movement here because I think that question is an old, silly question because we still have a lot to do. I mean, just ask literally any asexual person if we still have work to do. That's all I'm saying. Like, there is work to be done. And I think that we can still do that, but the only way that we're going to do that is if we, as queer identified and trans identified people, are more present at Pride festivals to push for our own spaces. I don't know that we necessarily have to, I'm not nostalgic in like going back to an original Pride, but I am nostalgic for is when Pride festivals could be multiple things, and I don't think they're doing that in the moment. But we have a ton of prides in Alabama. We've got Central Alabama Pride. We've got Rocket City Pride in Huntsville. We have Florence's strangely named Renaissance Pride. Don't really know why it's called Renaissance Pride, never did. We have Druid City Pride in Tuscaloosa. We have my favorite Pride festival that I've gone to in the last several years was Pride on the Plains in Auburn. It was a great Pride festival, organized well. It was a lot of good things happening in that space. And so we have a ton of prides. Mississippi has 10 Pride festivals now. There are more than 10 Pride festivals in Georgia, so we're doing the work. To me, the smaller prides are really getting it right. If you want to go to a fun Pride next year, if we can people again, go to Tupelo Pride in Tupelo, Mississippi. because they have that Pride in the middle of town in a damn town square, and it is fun. So I think that's the end of that for me. That's a lot, and I'm seeing now that there's like a million things in the chat. Sorry, I couldn't actually see the chat from my share screen.
I saved it for you, or I will save it for you so you can go back and read the comments. So you can see.
So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we want to do. I will announce for Invisible Histories that once we're allowed to be with each other again in a way that's, you know, more useful, we've collected a ton of new stuff, and I cannot wait to have you all to the archives at BPO to see the stuff that we've collected lately. There's a lot of really cool stuff. And we should very soon have, in fact, I haven't even talked to Amanda and Lauren about it yet, but the new exhibit that we're going to be putting up at Space 111, we're working on a piece that we want to go into the gallery that we want you as Magic City Acceptance Center to build for us. And so we'll talk to Lauren and Amanda about that closer to the end of the year as we get closer to that. Because we want you involved in the whole process, because we already think of you as involved in the process. And be on the lookout. Right now, I'm excited to say that we're digitizing 2 radical queer newsletters from Mississippi from the mid-1970s. One called Lesbian Front, which is so good that I cannot wait for you to read it. It is so gossipy and wonderful. And so every single day we have new stuff for you guys to see. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate you all letting me talk to you for an hour out of your day.
Josh, I appreciate you.
Yeah, that's a lot of information I know in an hour. So
no, you've been teaching me queer history for 10 years, and I still learn something new every single time, and appreciate the updates, like all the cool things that you find and come back and add. I will say
I'm always learning. You know, just when I feel like I got a handle on it, something new comes up.
Word. There was at one point, this wasn't a question, but I think it was Jay who said that he heard from his grandmother that the person that built the fountain in 5 Points was a gay.
Yes, he was indeed a gay. The designer was a gay. In fact, you know what was more scandalous about that fountain in 5 Points wasn't that he was a gay. It was that everyone felt like the fountain was too pagan because it has the goat head guy on it. The rumor is that he did that on purpose because it was going to be put in front of a church. But it's a storybook theme, so, you know, whatever. It's fine. But yeah.
Confirmed.
Confirmed.
We love to slap that confirmation label on somebody. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. I don't know if anybody else had any other questions before we go. Comments. Like I said, we recorded this so folks can come back and watch it later. And I'll post the video of the first Pride again for people to find it, or a couple other things.
Yeah, some things for you all to pass around to them later if you want to. The AIDS Memorial Quilt Foundation in San Francisco, they have digitized the entire AIDS Memorial Quilt. And so you can actually go in and search the quilt by just type in Birmingham and see all the panels from the quilt. It's very cool. I'm trying to think of what else I mentioned. And check out Georgia State's collection for Atlanta Pride, because they've got some really cool stuff there. I'm trying to think what else. If I think of something else, I'll send it to you.
Okay, cool. That's like the fun thing about online programs right now is immediately just dropping links that people can all see together. So that's kind of cool.
Yes. I really like that.
Well, if nobody else has any other questions or comments, I reckon we can wrap on up.
Thanks for having me, y'all.
Josh, thank you so much.
Yes, I'll have me back anytime.
Please, we'll bug you.
All right, y'all be good. Stay safe.
Yeah, thanks y'all for popping in. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, Amanda, let me save the chat first. Oh, never mind. I was still the host. Okay, cool. And